Hello, everyone. Welcome as the chat room fills up. Hello. Very exciting night. Got Tony on the line. He's going to be wonderful to chat to. Just wait for everyone to sort of log in. If you guys want to put where you're from, who you are in the chat, where you're from, that'll be awesome. We had one person from Germany once, which was pretty cool, tuning in. Hey, Robert. Nice to have you. Val, nice to have you. Colleen, hello. It's been a while. Good to have you. Oh, wow. Oh, you're here again from Berlin. That's awesome. Oh, good. Yeah, you're tuning into this one. Excellent. Jude, Robert from Brisbane, hometown represent. Wollongong. Katie from California. Very cool. Some international guests. Hi, Trisha, Mark, Nina, Melinda, Julie from Melbourne. I miss Melbourne. I was in Melbourne on the school holidays for a wedding. Love that place. So nice and cold. Oh man, we got lots of people here. This is awesome. Welcome, guys. For everyone who's new to Ben's Book Club, I'm just going to really quickly put into the chat a link to the Facebook group if you're interested. We just have chats about the books that we're reading over the course of the month. So if you want to join that group, everyone's more than welcome. Don't have to, but it's if you want to keep this conversation going and maybe send me some questions before you come. The other thing is to just for those of you who are new to Ben's Book Club, while I'm chatting with Tony, you guys might be having some questions for him or just some thoughts about the book. We're completely spoiler heavy in this book club because we're assuming everyone's read the book. But would love for you guys to be posting your questions for Tony as well, and I'll be reading them to Tony so we can sort of get through that. But without further ado, let me introduce Tony. Tony Birch is the author of 3 novels, the best-selling The White Girl, which is what we're going to chat about today. Love this book. Loved it. Ghost River, and that won the Victorian Premier's Literary Award for Indigenous Writing, and Blood, which was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Awards. So he's a very acclaimed author. He's also the author of Shadowboxing and 3 short story collections, Father's Day, The Promise, and Common People. In 2017, he was awarded the Patrick White Literary Award. In 2021, he published 2 new books, Whisper Songs, a poetry collection, and Dark as Last Night, a book of short stories, both with UQP. And then in 2022, Dark as Last Night was awarded the Christina Steed Prize for Fiction. So Tony, if you wouldn't want to turn your video on and your microphone. Everyone, welcome Tony to Ben's Book Club.
Thank you very much for having me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I'm very excited to have you here. How are you? How is everything going in your life?
Everything's going really well, actually. I had one of my grandsons with me all day, and I've been very lucky that my eldest daughter, Erin, has just moved back from London after 8 years, and she brought 2 more grandkids home with her. So I've got all my 4 grandchildren in Melbourne, and things are really well. Obviously, there are obviously periods of great difficulty for other people.
Yeah.
Over the last couple of years with COVID, and we're also dealing with some terrible international situations. So I'm always aware of that to have perspective, but also then because of that, I always feel really grateful of having a really healthy, close family, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I think if anything, that time in our lives did make us appreciate when we can't, because my family's in Victoria, didn't miss seeing them for so long, And then when we get to spend time now, it's actually, you take a minute or 2 to sort of be grateful that you get to do this now. It's not you just take it for granted. It's something special. I noticed, Tony, I know this might be a strange question to start with. We sort of go back, we have a look at your life and your career before we get to talking about The White Girl. But I noticed in a lot of your photos of you that you have all these awesome tattoos on your arms. I don't know where else you have them. I've just started to get tattoos. But yeah, look at that. But I was wondering if there's any cool stories or anything you want to point out, like that's significant, or what the art means to you and things like that.
Well, there is a sort of a joke in my family. I have a very distressed looking buzzard on my upper arm that I got when I was 16 on the way to the football. And my advice to people was never get a tattoo on the way to the football. And not particularly when you're 16. And for many years, I thought I need to cover this buzzard up, because you see a lot of hipsters now with incredibly beautiful tattoos.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone joked and laughed about how pathetic my buzzard is. He's sort of hiding. He's here somewhere.
Yeah, I kind of do want to see him.
There he is. There he is. So he's like a reject from a Disney cartoon. And I was thinking of covering it up, and then I went into a very hip clothes store about 5 years ago with my partner Sarah, and a young guy behind the counter who had really beautiful tattoos. He pointed at my buzzard and said, "Is that a Johnny Entwistle?" And I said, "Yeah, it is." He said, "The tattooist who did that is Johnny Entwistle, isn't it?" I said,
Oh,
"Yeah."
man.
He said, "When did you get it?" I said, 1973. He goes, "Oh my God." And he got his phone out and started taking photos of it. He called another guy over and said, "This guy's got a Johnny Entwistle." And so since then, what I've realized is that I'm like an archive of tattoo history in Australia.
Yeah.
And I've also got one by a wonderful woman, Bev Connolly, who is a very well-known tattooist in Melbourne. So I've realized now that my tattoos are so old and so bad, they're now great. So it's, everything.
In again. Yeah, they're really cool again.
The only other thing is that I have quite distinct tattoos, which are what you might call, or not single tattoos, but my great grandfather was a man called Prince Moody, who was transported to what was then Van Diemen's Land, or what we know as Tasmania, from Barbados. One of the last transportees to come under the convict system. And not only did he take that amazing sea journey, and of course, being a descendant of slaves, his forebears from Africa also would have been sent across the ocean. He became a sailor. So I have some artwork which really tells the story of him in an abstract fashion, but certainly a story of him as a sailor. And that was a really interesting process, because the guy who did this, because Prince Moody, his main working relationships with Polynesian people around the Pacific Islands, a Maori friend of mine did the tattoo, and it was really interesting to sit down with him and talk about what story it might tell. And that was, rather than rush off to the footy after getting a tattoo on a whim, it was a genuine cultural process. So I really enjoyed that as well. So
that's cool. That's really cool.
Yeah, but I think, any advice for anyone out there, the older you get, the more they hurt. So I think it's a good time to stop, because I turned 65 this year, and I think if I got another tattoo, I'd pass out.
If I'm reading between the lines, though, I think you're encouraging everyone to get a lot of tattoos when they're very young, where it hurts less. Is that right? Did I read that right?
I am. Although in my first novel, Blood, one of my characters, John Dempsey, comes out of prison after many years in prison, and he goes into the post office to post a letter, and he walks out and says, "Even the postmistress has a tattoo." Sort of, it's like they don't mean anything anymore.
No.
So it is that old story, but true. When I was a kid, when you saw, growing up where I grew up, it's a very rough area. You see men, and occasionally, my grandmother had a tattoo, by the way, from when she was very young, which is unusual. My mum has tattoos, but it was very rare to see a woman with a tattoo, and men who had tattoos, you regard, as rough. And I can tell you now, when my first job in the public service, if there was any men who had a tattoo, they had to wear long sleeves all the time.
Yeah.
If you'd had a tattoo on your hand or your neck, which is quite popular now, you wouldn't get a job in a bank or somewhere.
No, yeah.
And you shouldn't rob a bank either if you've got a tattoo on your neck. It's a dead giveaway.
There's profile as you walk in, I guess.
Yeah,
But you've taken us on a bit of a journey there with the stories there, which were really cool. I appreciate you going through all that stuff with us. Some people in the chat are saying lots of good advice there, Tony. But I was wondering then, like, to take us into your journey as a storyteller. You've had a very long and career, but I mean, in the guise of a whole life, you've been sort of more recently published. So I was wondering where your journey started as an actual writer of texts. When
yeah.
did you start developing that, and then what caused you to start to put it out into the world?
Well, yeah. So, and it's probably, you're right. I mean, it's quite seriously, I do say if I do a workshop at a festival with younger writers, I didn't publish my first book until I was 49. So a very late bloomer. And I hadn't published any fiction, and probably from when I was about in my early 40s, I started to publish individual short stories. But I think there are two clear things is that, and this is not surprising, although I didn't do well the first time I was in high school, no fault of anyone's but my own. I was always a voracious reader, and I still am. I'm always reading a novel, and I can't remember. Yeah, from when I was about 5 or 6 years of age, as soon as I started primary school, I got my first library card at the Fitzroy Library. I'm still a member of the Yarra Library, which is what Fitzroy is now.
Yeah.
And so I've always been a great reader. And then I dropped out of school very young, bummed around a bit, got a really good job in the fire brigade, which also gave you a lot of spare time to read more. So I was reading right from my 20s and reading a lot of nonfiction. But people forget how good magazines like Rolling Stones were at social commentary, as now it's just a sort of rock and pop magazine. When I was younger, I read a lot of international political stuff for reading Rolling Stone, reading other really good sort of quarterly or monthly publications. So the only point I'm making there is that by the time I went to university when I was 30, that being a reader had really equipped me for scholarly work.
Yeah.
What happened? I was at Melbourne Uni. I just ended up staying there. I did an honours degree, a master's degree, a PhD, and I started teaching history there in about 1996. And in fact, so my first, what you might call published writing, I have an academic career in the sense that
Yeah.
I was publishing a lot of academic writing, and was until I retired 2 years ago. So that would mostly be in looking at history, contests over colonization. And then in the last 5 years of my full-time working life, I was looking at issues around climate justice and the environment. So
Yeah.
I published like what you might call literary nonfiction pieces, but I also published quite strict in the genre of academic writing.
Mm.
About 2001, I moved from teaching history to the English department. And it was there that I started to teach. They asked me to teach nonfiction writing, in fact, which I enjoyed. And it was only then that I started to write short stories. And initially, one or two short stories, and they were published. And then I realized that I wanted to produce a collection of linked short stories, which became the book Shadowboxing. And in a way, it just sort of took over.
Yeah.
So it was as if things tipped.
Mm.
Although having said that, until I retired from academia 2 years ago, I did run sort of a corresponding academic career. And I'm not suggesting the writing wasn't part of my academic life, but I was still publishing academic writing until I left.
Yeah.
I think for the people watching tonight, I think the two things are I think I come out of a really good family of where storytelling is really valued, and I'm good at telling a story when I was a kid. So I often say I lived on a housing commission estate, Richmond high-rise estate. And, a lot of kids, you just sit around talking bullshit and swimming down the river. And I could frame a story when I was telling a story quite well.
Yeah.
And I think if I combine that with a love of reading, in other words, you're always teaching yourself or upskilling, I think. And then, later in life thinking, okay, now I want to put those two things together. And I think short fiction, the short story is still my favorite form. And I think it's where
Really?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So my last book, the one that just won the Steed Prize,
Hmm.
I wrote that during I finished that and wrote a lot of news stories during the first lockdown. Like we're in lockdown 27 in Melbourne, I think,
Hmm.
by the time we got out of it. And I really felt it to be a flourishing sort of period for me. And what happens when I'm writing short stories, they tend to come in a sort of a burst of ideas, and I tend to write, usually a package of say half a dozen stories. I can write the drafts of those sort of in a couple of months.
Wow. That's pretty impressive, man. And when you say that it's your more preferred form, do you mean the stuff that you actually devour as well as the stuff you produce, or do
No,
you?
no, not as a reader. I mean, one of the things about a short story, I can occasionally finish one in bed of a night before falling asleep. Yeah, when I was a kid, and this happens, I think, to a lot of readers. When you're younger, I could, get in the bed about 10 o'clock at night and put the light off at midnight. Yeah, 2 hours, 100 pages or whatever.
Hmm.
I get in at 10 o'clock and I look at a short story and I think, oh, 20 pages. I don't know. So you tend to fall asleep a lot quicker. There is that sort of pragmatism about reading short stories, but I do love reading short stories. But at the moment, for instance, at the moment I'm reading a crime novel by David Peace, who was an English writer who
Yeah.
wrote his famous trilogy, Red Riding trilogy. He moved to Tokyo, and I'm reading his Tokyo crime trilogy at the moment. So I read crime, I read literary stuff. No, I'm talking more as a writer.
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
So I've just started. I've got about 7,000 words of the new novel, and I'll I'm enjoying it, and so I look forward to what I'll be doing the next day. But it's hard to explain it. It does feel more like work. You've got a lot more to hold together.
Mm.
You can lose your patterns and your structures if you're not really thinking about it. The thing about a short story is might seem odd for your readers. People always compare a short story to a novel. I often think of a short story in the same way that I think of a poem. There's
Yeah.
just one simple sort of idea at the heart of it, and I can crystallize and develop that idea in my head. I mean, I might take occasional note, but yeah, I'm a runner. I'm a lifelong runner. And if I've got an idea for a short story, or if I've been doing a bit of writing, I might go for a long run. And while I'm out there, I start to sort of structure a scene in my head, and I don't lose it. I can come home and write 500 words or something. I,
Mm.
I can't do that with a novel. I mean, in fact, when I'm running, if I'm thinking about something in a novel, I try to stop thinking about it because it just becomes more confusing because
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
too much to deal with. So I think a novel for me is, and I think for a lot of people, it's harder in the sense that it feels like, to put it simply for people watching, it feels like work that you enjoy doing and work that you don't always enjoy doing. I mean,
Mhm.
when I finished my three novels, I have loved, finished, and filmed, particularly with The White Girl. When I finished the penultimate draft of The White Girl, I did think where it's at the moment. So there was still work to do. I'm really pleased with what I've done in the sense that I think I've done what I set out to do.
Yeah.
You
Well,
know,
I think that's a very rare feeling to have after completing something.
yeah. But during the writing, you don't have the same. Well, I don't have the same confidence in the work as I do of a short story. So I
Mm.
published a lot of short stories, and now four. It depends if you call shadowboxing a collection. Five collections, which is not common in Australia. And if I write a draft for a short story, I usually know by the end of the first draft, I think I've got a publishable story here if I work on it. And when I say publishable, I'm not saying it will be published, because rejection is a lifelong process for any writer. But I know by the end of that draft, I can get this up to a standard where I'm happy
Mm.
to send it off and see if someone wants to publish it.
Yeah, so where you're feeling satisfied with
Yeah,
what it
yeah,
is, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I feel like and we'll move to talking about the white girl now. And I'll just remind everyone, if you have questions for Tony or want to pipe in, feel free to post some stuff in the chat. I actually feel with this book that I felt like it was very complex, but it didn't feel overly complicated, if that makes sense. And I feel like that's what a good short story does as well. Like it's really refined and it's really clear about its intentions and it doesn't feel fussy and doesn't, with subplots that maybe don't go everywhere. And I've just felt like with this book, it was really, really meaningful and complex and emotional, but it didn't feel overly complicated. I hope that makes sense. Did you
Yeah, I
feel?
mean, no, it does. I mean, there are two things there is that I carried this idea for quite a while. And by the time I get to start to write, I had a fair, clear sense of what it was going to do. Um, and you're right.
Just felt clear. That's the best word.
Yeah,
Clear, right? Yeah.
and I didn't want to overly complicate the plot. My second novel, Ghost River, which I really love, I on reflection, it just had too many plot threads. I could have written five novels of five volumes.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's because I think with Ghost River, because it was so close to me, because it's about two boys growing up around the Birrarung, the Yarra River in the early 70s, which I had done. There was so much. It's one of those things, unfortunately, where your real life experience, although it can be really helpful to a fictional work, you can fall into the trap where you think, therefore, all my real life experience has to be in this fictional work, which is a bit of a problem. But I think that's relative to another issue. I wanted to keep the language quite simple and direct as well.
Yeah,
And my
yeah.
sense here is that hoping that a reader would understand that the simplicity of language is not simple in a negative
No.
sense, that by using simple language, you can create enough space for the reader to get a sense of the emotional complexity.
Yeah, yeah.
So
A lot going on under the surface sort of
so
stuff.
I felt confident in that. I felt confident. It's very much a book about tenderness, even though obviously the book is surrounded by the potential of violence. Often, the so-called bath scene, the first bath scene, is sort of indicative of that tactile physical relationship between Odette and Sissy. So when she washes her granddaughter's hair,
Yeah, so beautiful.
that to me stands as a sort of, that epitomizes the love between them. And while it's deeply emotional and spiritual, it is physical. So that
You can really see it playing out,
yeah,
right? Like it's really
yeah.
tactile. Yeah.
So Odette's body, her physical body, is really important to me in this book. That there's that sense of her physicality being such a presence of strength for her granddaughter. And I was, there is, I mean, you will hear writers argue, and I think it's valid that if your book to really work, when you're writing, the characters will change, or they'll challenge you, or they'll their personality will shift. And I would say that's interesting to the point that in the novel I'm working on now, that very point is pertinent to me around one of the characters. Will he or won't he, show himself to be something other than what he is?
Yeah.
I have to be quite honest and say that with the white girl, I had a predetermined idea that Odette would be she'd be wonderful, and she'd be the rock of the book and the center. And when I say, therefore, the notion that she would be someone other than she was would not have appealed to me at all.
Yeah.
And I deliberately, I mean, if anyone knows this history, if you know Australian popular culture, and particularly film culture, if you look at the so-called renaissance of Australian film from the 70s, Aboriginal people appear as either victims, as violent people themselves, or as victims, silent victims of violence. And if you look at a lot of films, those 70s and 80s films, if an Aboriginal female character is in a film, usually she's not named, and she's most likely to be violently acted against and raped and murdered. And what I wanted to do was to write a book where, while violence threatens the Aboriginal women in the book, so Sissy, certainly Odette, and even someone, Millie Khan, and Dolores, of course, the woman who she meets that time who suffered terribly, and Alma talking about her family, minor character towards the end of the book, is that Wanda, of course, is that for all of those women, love would be at the heart of it. Now, clearly for the poor character Dolores, we don't get to witness that. But if you think of Millie, if you think of Sissy, if you think of Odette, and if you think of Odette showing care to Wanda and the loving relationship between Jack and Alma, is that these Aboriginal women are very loving women, and they're surrounded by loving people. And to me, that was so important to do. And it might shock some of your readers, but again, if I reflect back to working as a historian at university, I have to remind people that when the Bringing Them Home report came out in 1997, which was the Human Rights and Equal Opportunity Board's inquiry into the removal of Aboriginal children from family, the reception of that report in the press, and in the right wing but established press, so I'm talking about daily newspapers, there was, commentators were talking about, well, at that time, here they're talking about, pre-1970s, although, Aboriginal children are still taken away, that these women didn't love their children, or these women were happy to have their children taken because they'd have a better life. So all of that, I wanted to, just through action, to show these people deeply love and care for their children, which, most people take for granted. But the demonisation of Aboriginal women in popular culture, sometimes, through political discourse, I didn't want to actually actively address that. I wanted to write a book which dispelled that through the way that characters interacted. So I didn't want to write a didactic book. I wanted to write a book that in the end, it has to be I always say, people often say, do you think your work's political? I think it probably is, but I don't write to be political. I write to tell really good stories.
Yeah. In reading the book, it never struck me as sort of like a preachy didactic book at all. It struck me as this really delicate portrait of these strong women, and I never read it any other way. And I guess if you had some sort of if you were hell bent against this type of character or type of portrayal or representation, then maybe this would be much more political text. But it was just such a beautiful story. It's hard for me to imagine a person reading this and sort of taking umbrage with it. You know what I mean? But I'm sure that's happened.
Oh yeah, it has happened. I mean, it might be a screaming coincidence, but the one reviewer and look, the three, and it's when I say the three people, three commentators, one review. I mean, the reviews were fantastic. It was shortlisted for the Miles. It won the New South Wales Premiers for Indigenous writing. So again, it's been very well received. The three commentators who didn't like the book, and for those reasons that I've just discussed, were all older white men, which might be a coincidence.
Yeah.
Look, having said that, Ben, that comes with the turf of being a writer. You can't, I don't go around complaining, they don't know what they're talking about. I might think they don't know what they're talking about, but that's bad luck. You've got to take, that. The only disappointment I ever had was actually, in some ways surprisingly, a very well-known ABC journalist, Raphael Epstein, who does the afternoon program in Melbourne. When a woman was reviewing the book on his show and talked about how much she enjoyed it, he actually said he couldn't finish the book because he couldn't relate to any of the characters. And that was a very difficult thing to hear, because as a reader, so here I'll put my reader's hat on.
Yeah.
I always barrack for any book I'm reading. I want it. You go into a bookshop and buy it. You go to a library and borrow a book. You don't want to not like it.
No.
And even when a book's not working, I'll stick with it. I'll sort of, I want the writer to work. I want the book to work. So for me to put a book down and not complete it, it has to be a book I really feel is failing for me. And I don't talk about those books publicly because that's really unfair. So for him to say he couldn't finish the book, that disappointed me in a way that it felt I have done something here that has disappointed a reader. Now that really in context is meaningless because so many people have enjoyed the book, but it was, I felt really defensive for Odette.
Yeah, I don't blame you, yeah.
And you have those sort of surreal thoughts. I actually, I lost track of rationality because I tell that to Odette, you know, because she'll set you straight, you know. So
Yeah, geez.
yeah, but
Yeah, I struggle to comprehend that kind of comment
yeah,
about this book. I read this book in a day, and
yeah.
I read. I don't know how you go because I'm sure you read a lot of books for your work as well. Like I'm sure people ask you to do reviews and covers and things like that.
Yeah, I actually don't do reviews. I mean,
Yeah,
I review Gary Dish's crime novel every year. It's like a tradition.
tradition.
I
Yeah,
love his book. I actually do think as a nominally literary writer, and I use the term loosely, I don't think it's a good idea. I actually don't think it's a good idea for writers to be reviewers to the extent that, yeah, if I read another writer's work and didn't like it, I'd probably hand it back to to the newspaper or whatever. I just don't think it's good to diss on other writers. I think
I yeah, I
that,
always find I can always
that
find stuff to
yeah,
be happy with. Like I always try to be on the side of the author.
yeah,
But what I just mean that I have to read a lot of books,
right.
and I have to, and I enjoy most of them, but a lot of the time it's like a job. But this one was a pleasure. I was on holiday and I read this in a day. Like it was such a pleasure to read. It was like a relief to read about
Okay.
these beautiful people.
Thank you very much.
Um, so, if you don't mind, I'll go back just a little bit. I got this question from Melinda, and I was interested in this as well because I heard something shocking that you said. But Melinda's asked, how long did it take from the first draft to the finished
Ah,
novel?
I know,
Now, I
Melinda.
heard
I know,
that it was a
Melinda.
shocking amount of time for your first draft. Can you tell everyone in the chat how long
Yeah.
it took you?
So, Melinda, that's a great question, and I can set the record straight here. Um, I just give more advice. Yeah, I'll give them tattoo advice. I can give
Yes, it's what
running
we like.
advice, not drinking advice. I don't drink, so good. What's so great
That's
about me?
advice in and of itself.
Yeah. One advice I give here is if you give a quote to a journalist, please ask them to quote the whole sentence. So Paul Daly actually, who's just brought out a novel called Jesus Town, I think the Guardian.
Yeah, heard of that one.
Yeah, Paul interviewed me, and he said to me, "How long did it take to write this book?" And I will now give Melinda the complete sentence.
Sure.
And I said, I did the roughest of all drafts in 2 months and the second draft in 1 year. He only put the 2 months.
That's all I heard. Yeah, that's what I got
Yeah,
written
and
down
then
here.
not
Yeah.
only was there the 1 year, and then there was the 6 month editing process, which was a lot of what we call structural editing, about moving scenes around. So moving, creating more tension so that you've got the policeman back in the town, and then you've got Odette on the run. So you get switches back and forward. So from the first writing to the what I would call the first full draft, it was actually a year, and then I would have spent about 6 months working with an editor, which I love doing. I mean, people often think of editors there just to look after your full stops and spelling, which they are. And I just say, whatever you tell me, you can put a comma anywhere you like. You're the
You know what
expert.
you're doing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. But what I love doing with an editor is structural editing, so that just to put it into perspective, an editor might say, look, I think this scene here is a bit rushed. You might want to just stretch it a bit. Or they might say, oh, this reveal here, it feels a bit early. And that I love that, because what that does, that challenges you to go back and to improve that through writing. So, and of course, you've got to have a trustful relationship with your editor, and I always have. So I think all in all, about 18 months would be the time. And that's still quick. I mean, some writers take years and years to do a book. I tend to, like, once I've started a new project and I sort of clear the decks to do it, I do, I can write about 10,000 words a month.
That's pretty prodigious.
Yeah, so that's about 2,000 words a week, but that would be writing, but it sounds a lot, but in a week, it might be 500 words a day, and then doing a bit of trimming and stuff. So
Yeah, so sort of like you build it up and then you refine it down and then
yeah. So, to me, it's back and forward. So I just said I'd started a new book, and I've written about 7,000. Now I know rather than go on tomorrow, I'm going to go back and just try and clean up any mess and get the pitch just right before I move on. So I tend to spend a lot of time working on pitch and mood, say for the first 10,000 words. And then when I think I've got that, it's like, okay, I've got the sound now, I've got the beat, you know what I mean? I've got the rhythm, and then I can go on a lot more quickly. So what that does as a writer, for me anyway, is that when you've got the pitch and you start to write, say your next scene or your next chapter, it's like you can hear a bad note really easily.
Yeah, for sure.
In the first phase, you can't do that. So I like to get to a stage where it's a bit like someone playing a piano and suddenly they hit a dud note. You want to be able to hear that rather than not hear it, and you go through and write, your big full draft with a lot of dud notes in it. Then the editing or the second draft would be much harder and much less enjoyable, I think.
Yeah, I've had a few instances in, because I have a new book coming out next year. I've had a few instances going over the proofs actually the last week, which is sort of the final thing. But I've had a few times where I've had to change something later on that I've seen in a better light now. And then I have to sort of agonizingly backtrack through and make sure I don't refer to it. And there's,
so that's right. So you've got to have those little notes and signals that And the other thing, of course, is that having said that, it's never perfect anyway. So this morning I'm jumping the gun because it's still under embargo. I'm about to be shortlisted for another award for Dark as Last Night.
Nice.
And I had to send a 50-word extract from one of the stories today. And even when I read that, when I had the book and then I put the 50 words into an email, there was one word and I thought, that shouldn't be there. Not a mistake, so it's not a spell mistake. I would normally take that word out. Now, and even when you do a reading, you might read, I don't like reading that much, but I read a couple of pages. I'll actually edit as I'm reading.
Yeah, I've been there.
Yeah, so you do find that you're never
perfect.
But you've got to let it go at some stage. Otherwise, if you could sit there with a red pen and go on forever. And of course, as you develop as a writer, if you're getting better or if you're refining what you're doing better, there are little ticks in your work that you notice that you didn't realize at the time. So that's I mean, I have heard of people rewriting their work when they're bringing out new editions. I wouldn't do that. I think it's almost like it's an artifact of its time.
Yeah,
and I think you've got
that's a healthy way of looking at it for sure.
Accept any blemishes in the work.
Yeah, I think Lars Ulrich said, the drummer from Metallica, but I know he stole it from someone. But he said that what does he say? Great art is never finished; it's just abandoned. I don't know whether you agree with that.
Well, Metallica would know.
It's
abandoned in their case.
I want to go back here. I've got a question. I'm apologizing, Alida. I hope I'm saying your name correctly. But Alida is saying that I chose The White Girl last year for everyone to read in the high school staff reading challenge. So everyone in the staff had to read this book. It was an excellent introduction for many of them in terms of seeing some of our recent social history within a great fictionalized story. Can I ask you, first of all, that's an awesome compliment. So thank you, Alida. But in addition to that, was that the starting of this book? Was the original germ of the idea that you wanted to present this part of our history? Or did you start with a character? Or what was the original impetus to actually start work on this book?
It's probably a really good combination of both. So a little bit of backtrack from me is that when I was working as a historian at university, obviously, even though I'd finished my PhD, I was also working on new research projects. And one of my projects that I worked on for many years was actually looking at Aboriginal women's writing, writing that mostly existed in the archive of the Public Records Office in Melbourne or Australian Archives at Lonsdale Street. And that was letters by Aboriginal women to chief protectors, Aboriginal Welfare Board members, local police. And basically women at the absolute grassroots level of living on missions and reserves, living in country towns, of basically struggling and fighting for rights to have their children kept with them, to improve their living conditions,
Yeah.
discussion about land rights, all that sort of stuff. So I published work on that. I published also some poetry called Archive Box Poems, where I used some of the words. So I felt I wanted to do something more significant with that. There was also the issue of Aboriginal women generally. So, in my own family, my grandmother in particular, thinking these are, I've really been surrounded by remarkable Aboriginal women all of my life. So I did want to write a book that told the story of how these women have kept community and family together under great duress. So that was the case. And again, as I said, to tell a story about tenderness and love. Having said that, I always felt that this would be a book that I think would help introduce people to a complex history in a fairly simple and direct way and an emotional way. So there was an objective to tell that history. I think the issue, though, is, say, particularly at a teaching level, for people to get, sorry, I've just got to get rid of something on my screen.
You're right.
For people to get a greater understanding of this history, it does also then require people to go on and do some legwork. So that, I talk about the caste legislation a little bit, but for instance, very few people in this country know that the Victorian colonial government in 1886 introduced what is infamously called by Aboriginal people as the Half-Caste Act, where the Victorian government introduced the first formal piece of legislation that divided Aboriginal people up into categories of caste and blood quantum, so that depending on your age, depending on your definition of the offensive terms of octoroon, quarter caste, half caste, etc., is that your life was then determined, your future was determined according to your caste, and that could be, as bad as being completely separated from family and having your children taken.
Yeah, wow.
The other issue there, Ben, is that piece of legislation became the template for the sort of model after federation, where states were given the residual rights to introduce their own legislation. So a really telling example would be in Western Australia with A.O. Neville, who, of course, people know through the film Rabbit Proof Fence. Yeah. A.O. Neville is regarded as sort of the father of assimilation, which is a really poor way of describing someone who was hell-bent on destroying people's culture and identity by destroying colour. So, when I taught at university, it was always very frustrating when I would say to students, and not to the students, I was never angry at the students, do you realise, this city that we're living in introduced this infamous Caste Act? And students would look at you with utter disbelief, not in the sense that you were lying, that they'd been lied to.
They couldn't believe it, yeah.
Well, they can't believe it. And in fact, we're still trying to, people hear the term truth-telling a lot now. This is a story that needs to be told, because it really is, if you want to understand this Australian identity, individual or collective, you've got to know that story. It's the basis for everything that came afterwards. I mean, it's the basis for the White Australia policy, the Immigration Act, which is the first piece of the first act in the Constitution.
Yeah. Can I ask you? Do you think that a book, like a work of fiction, teaches us things in ways that perhaps non-fiction can't? Because I know I'm a high school teacher. I know there are students who do history and they sort of learn facts and figures and things of history. But then they read an actual text and they get to actually experience these things through the eyes of someone else. I don't know. Do you feel like fiction can, I don't know whether teach is the right word, but it sort of brings a different thing to us, right? I
mean, obviously someone who worked both as a historian and was as a creative writer, as a novelist, I'm in both camps. And I suppose my response, it's not to be a fence sitter. I actually think that I took an approach to history that every text matters. So I think clearly, if you're engaged with a fiction book, it can engage you with an issue that may otherwise seem dry. But you don't want your your fictional figures just to stand in place for reality. What I would suggest is that if I were to say, look at this issue, around removal of children, I would argue, yes, I think the White Bill is a very legitimate, important text. But me, I wouldn't look at it, say, without looking at some really telling and important government documents. And yeah, it might put people off to say it's good to read a novel, but I'd also be reading legislation to understand. Yeah, here's a really good example. How is it that a policeman like Sergeant Lowe in this book would understand the pain that he would cause this woman, but he would just be hell-bent to cause that pain anyway?
Yeah.
If you read the legislation, you read the chilling dryness in the commentary of politicians who actually, it's not as if people didn't realise that Aboriginal people were suffering. This is a great myth as well. People knew how much Aboriginal people were suffering. You can read newspaper reports from the 1930s where reporters write about children being taken from mothers and those mothers hitting themselves in the head with rocks and, you know, self-harming because of their absolute grief. So people were completely aware of how much harm they were doing, but in the legislation, when it was brought up, say, in the parliament, so in Hansard, which is a recording of a parliamentary debate, you know, a minister for Aboriginal Affairs would say, we understand the grief that this mother is suffering, but what we are doing is for the best interest of the child. So in a way, if you read that legislation, you get Sergeant Lowe in a way, you think, okay, I really get these sort of people now. So I've had, I mean, one of the reviewers of this book who genuinely liked the book said that, oh, the Sergeant Lowe character is, you know, he's too dark. He must be more complex than that. And I was thinking, no, he's actually not much more complex than that. He's evil. And when I say that word evil, although I'm using it advisedly, when you consider what these men, and it was always men, what they said about Aboriginal people and their right to control these people, it comes across as very sinister. And to our ears, I suppose, Ben, I'm really interested in photography, so I'd be looking at photographs. So when I taught history, I would say to my students, what you need to come up with is a complex understanding of the past, and therefore you've got to look at the range of modes of storytelling, the modes of documentation, and that fiction is a legitimate form. So I never liked just the sort of simple, say a lot of debates around Kate Grenville's Secret River would be, well, this is fiction, this is not history, and history that tells the real story. I think that sort of clear split is ridiculous because one of people who argue for history or the facts of history telling the real story, that's pretty simplistic because I'll give you a really good example. People often go to court transcripts to find the truth. Well, we know people tell lies in court every day under oath, and they get away with it.
That's true.
There are ethical politicians and there are unethical politicians. So you wouldn't go to the Hansard and say, oh, it's in the Hansard and this politician said that, so I'll just take what he says as fact. So you've got to do a lot of analytical work, I suppose, is the point. It's not, you don't want to go and watch the Titanic and say, oh, this is what happened to Jack and Rose, you know. So, and my kids, I say, no, that's Leonardo DiCaprio.
That's a great example. No, that's a great example there, because you go and watch Jack and Rose and you get swept up in this story and you're like, wow. And then you go read books about the Titanic and real stories and I said the word real there. I don't know whether I...
No, but I mean, it is a problem when I was teaching history, and I also taught general Australian history, and students would relay a story, and I'd say, yeah, but that was in a movie you saw. We've got to now get to the complexity. So I suppose, and with Aboriginal people, of course, is that we're talking about when we talk about text. A lot of Aboriginal vital storytelling, and not just sort of, what people dismiss as folklore. I'm talking about spiritual stories around ownership of country, stories around custodial roles, stories around women's business, men's business. A lot of those stories and histories are constructed through song, through dance, and something that people often don't know. So in Victoria, we're Victorian nations, Aboriginal nations. People often look at a possum skin cloak and they think, it's just a cloak to keep you warm, which of course it would have come in very handy. But if you look at the inside of the cloaks, on the skin side, you'll see a lot of graphics and text. people dismiss that, or historically that's often been dismissed as artwork. And it's artistically brilliant, but those documents on the back of a cloak, that they're like land title deeds, or they might be about people's authority within a group.
Yeah.
So in other words, when you think about Aboriginal documentation of the past, the range of forms is incredibly diverse and dynamic. And another one, of course, would be what people refer to as rock art. Again, I'm not saying it's not artistic, but rock work. It's the construction of a narrative.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And then when we're talking about like this idea of, I guess, what would you call them? Exclusive historians who say that there's only one way to get your history right. And then obviously those history books that they're referring to, it's like this exclusive club, and everything else underneath it, it's not included as much, or at least it hasn't been.
Well, what they say in university is that the historians see themselves as the aristocracy of the humanities. they're a hard group to shift.
I want to take your class, Tony. I feel like I could learn a lot from you.
I mean, that's the interesting thing there, Ben. I said earlier, I've been working in the climate justice space. And what I found that really excited about is that it's interesting because scientists are seen as rational and dry. The work that some scientists are doing now with Indigenous nations and communities around Indigenous ecological knowledge is really dynamic, in the sense of not saying, oh, this is just an Aboriginal story of place, this is an Aboriginal foundation story or mythical story, understanding that storytelling is related to ecological care of country. So there's really good work being done between science and Aboriginal ecological knowledge, which I think is more advanced than what you've just talked about in relationship to, in some ways, aspects of the humanities in universities, which are still very exclusive to some, quite hierarchical and very protective of space.
Yeah, for sure.
It's harder to get into a history department than is the Masons.
Well, I've never tried to get into either of those, so I don't know. But you're speaking from experience. We're nearly out of time, if you can believe it. I don't know how that went by so quickly. I'll go to a couple more things here.
I'll take a few more questions. That's fine.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Tony. Appreciate that. So Shelley, and I thought this would be an interesting question for you. Shelley is asking, what are the challenges of switching voices as you start on a new work? And you've got so many interesting voices in this book. You do have Sergeant Lowe's perspective. You have Odette's. You've got a lot of cool characters in here. How did you go about balancing all that?
Well, I think the first thing is that my work is very much character driven always. And I think that I spend a lot of time doing what I call character portraits or biographies when I'm starting. So I have a few idiosyncratic sort of habits. Like I have to name a character before I've written a word. So I really think hard about names. I'll think about their demeanor. So, with someone like Odette, what I knew was, while she's a very strong and courageous woman, she will know that she's got to be very strategic in her relationships with non-Aboriginal people.
Mm-hmm.
Strain herself. So there's only one moment where she doesn't do that, when she gets the knife in the farmhouse, where she's thinking of stabbing old Cain. So generally she knows that she can't just speak up, because that would be more dangerous for Sissy. So in other words, that when you think about that, then you think, well, then how does she converse? Well, generally she's a woman who's not going to say a lot. She's not, she's going to hold her own counsel a bit. So you start to think about that. Millie Khan, I already knew that she'd be a lot more, have a lot more cheek, be a bit in your face a bit. So thinking her voice is a bit different. And then, of course, you've got to manage the voice of a child like Sissy, which I like doing kids' voices. I've always had kids in all my novels. And having 5 kids who are now adults, I've got good sort of role models to work on. To go with Shelley's question, though, I think it's really important that I think getting the voice of the characters again on pitch is vital, and that helps keep pitch for the rest of it. I think the other aspect of that, what Shelley's alluding to is now that I've started a new novel, and this is mainly driven by two male characters, which I haven't done for a while. Again, it's interesting because I've got an Aboriginal male character, an older man in his 50s, who has to come across, or does come across initially, as someone who quite, deferring to a white man. He understands, but in fact, it's all a game. He's actually himself a very formidable man.
Yeah,
A
strategically.
dangerous man in some ways. So
Yeah, right.
how you change that voice. So I suppose the thing for Shelley is to write it, read it again and again, and try and get that rhythm and beat as accurate as you can. And I do love the challenge in a new book of finding the distinctive nature of each voice.
Yeah, it's so cool.
By the way, it's why I loved Henry Lamb as a character in this book. I felt I could really sense Henry's presence very early on.
I loved, Henry. Yeah, what a beautiful character.
Yeah, and
Just
he was
felt
really
so much for
important.
him.
He's so important, Ben, because I didn't want to write a sort of black-white book in the sense that all the Aboriginal people were just good and all the white people were just bad. That again, you're talking about history. You ask any Aboriginal person growing up in a country town, people had very difficult relationships, but often they will talk about having a loving relationship with friends who are non-Aboriginal. And I'm interested in why that's possible. So I think for Henry, he's sort of challenged in some ways. People might say he's intellectually challenged, but he has great emotional intelligence and cannot comprehend how anyone would treat Odette and Sissy with anything other than respect.
And I thought Bill Shea was in that as well. Like
Yeah,
he was
Bill,
very
Bill Shea's a very tragic character, and rightly so.
yeah, like I feel like him, you get that little picture of him as a kid where he was just open and not, the culture hadn't yet invaded everything that he had. Like he was just playing with Odette, right? And then his parents came in and sort of drilled sort of this idea of shame and this barrier between the two characters, and
Yeah.
he started to become like, it's such a tragic picture, and it was so compassionate, I thought.
Yeah, and I think one of the issues about Shay, and I know this through real experience, of he's destroyed by racism. And people, when I talk to students at schools, which I do a lot, I say, and it's not like an excuse, or it's not being overly sympathetic, but when you think of how evil racism is and how destructive it is, if you take it, Bill Shea and Lowe's models, racism destroys one of them. It destroys Bill Shea, and it doesn't destroy Lowe at all, because he's pathological in some senses. But racism is really insidious in the sense it has a negative impact on the dominant society, and can be really destructive to a dominant society.
Yeah, it doesn't help anyone. We'll finish up there, Tony. I've got one more thing here, which I thought was really beautiful just to end on, and then I have a little bit of a wrap-up thing. Annie said this: Tony, are you aware of the healing quality of some of your stories and novels? And then gone on to say, reading Father's Day helped to restore some of my family relationships in a very healing manner without ignoring the difficult stuff. So just appreciate that question, and that's very vulnerable and nice of you to say. But Tony, just have you ever considered that your books can heal?
Well, I think that I have to say, I did say, I said it, I think before we started tonight, I love doing book groups and libraries in particular, because you learn so much about your own work. And I've just learned that there through that comment. I would say that going out and talking to readers, not exclusively, but particularly when older women, they really get that, and they really get that insight. So Father's Day would be an example of that. My point, I suppose, is say, well, I found it healing for myself, so that I come from a very difficult family life of, quite incredibly difficult father who died in December, and very, occasionally very violent man. And I think that writing has been, in a way of understanding that. In my latest collection, I think, no, it's not. Sorry, I think it's in Common People. I have a story called Paper Moon, which is a very gentle story about a girl who goes to visit her father in a psychiatric institution and decides that she can help him escape. And the story ends with her taking her dad's hand, who's, he's doped up on all sorts of medication, and she takes his hand. They just go and sit on the bus, and they go down the back of the bus and waiting for the bus to leave, and that's where the story ends. And that's my favorite story that I've ever written. The point being here, though, is that my dad was in a psychiatric institution, locked up for many years, and I used to go and visit him, but I've never felt that affection towards him. And I really believe that story, Paper Moon, it was a way of me, as through being this female character, it was about me being able to express love rather than frustration or anger or disappointment. So I never again set out to write a didactic story. I never set out to do something cathartic or cleansing. I think it's only after you've finished the story and you might look at it. So just to close on that is that I think all of the children in my work are in some way versions of me, or so in other words, they're always great. None of the kids in my books or stories, you love them. We always love them. So, my family side, but you want everyone to think you're a great kid when you weren't.
Well, I think you're a great kid, Tony. Thank you. Everyone's saying in the chat just how awesome you've been tonight, Tony. So I'd love to, if you guys, I don't know how Zoom does it, but thank you, Tony, for being so generous with your time and answering all of our questions and telling us all these stories. So I really appreciate your time tonight, Tony. Thank you.
I really, as I said, I love doing this stuff, and it's great to know there are so many people reading the work. And someone said, look forward to your next book.
Yeah, you saw that one, yep.
I
Look
think
at all these comments, man. Everyone loves you.
We're looking at the second half of next year, probably maybe August or September. We may have it out by, but we're not going to rush it. And we're having it out probably with a UQP are going to do a classic series, and they're going to republish my first novel, Blood, with an introductory essay by another writer. So, yeah.
Oh, that's cool. All right.
It should be good.
I'll keep an ear out for that one too.
All right. You're really great interviewer, by the way, so thanks for the conversation.
Oh, thank you. Well, we'll have to have you back for the new one, man. We'd love to have you back.
I'll come back anytime.
Oh, thank you. So just a couple of quick things before I let everyone go. I'm just posting in the chat again the Facebook group for Ben's Book Club if you're interested. We had a good convo about the white girl on there with a few people, so we'd love to get everyone's thoughts and comments on there. Tune in to Library Lovers, which is on the third Wednesday of the month at 7 p.m. on Zoom. So this is the sort of the sister program to Ben's Book Club. Next month's guests are author Tori Hashka, narrator Casey Withus, and Mountain Libraries. And Maya also has award-winning money guru Victoria Devine and Jane Harper coming up in the next few months. So there's going to be some really cool interviews with Maya. And next month for Ben's Book Club, we are reading a novel published. This is the debut novel of a man named Frank Chalmers. It's called Conviction. And he is published at the very young and spry age of 75. His first book. So it's never too late. So it's going to be a really good chat. I'm looking forward to it. I actually missed out because I had COVID last week. I was supposed to launch his book in Brisbane and I missed out. So I'm excited so I can finally use all the questions I had for him and ask him. But thank you, Tony, and thank you everyone for being a part of Ben's Book Club.
Have a good night and we'll see you again. Bye.
Yeah, see you again, Tony. Thank you very much. And thanks everyone. See you all later.